Okay, so welcome everybody, and we are resuming our study of the synthesis of yoga, yoga of knowledge section, and we're in the chapter, the modes of the self. I think Michael has come on and he has his video on. So the modes of the self, and this chapter is following the succession of the ideas related to the yoga of knowledge. So Sri Aurobindo has taken us through a quasi-traditional path regarding the yoga of knowledge, uh, in which he has addressed the issue of the separation of the Purusha and Prakriti. In other words, uh, the person or the conscious being and the nature. So this kind of separation is a Sankhya process, and this Sankhya process is also uh, assimilated by a number of other schools like Vedanta, the Gita, through the Gita, in fact. So we find that he does this through a consideration of the ego and how the ego is present in mind, life, and body, and how we can gradually separate ourselves from the identification of the ego at each of these levels, and then come up with a kind of essential ego. Uh, and then find that we can go behind that to the true Purusha. So once we get to the true Purusha, which is the witness self, Sri Aurobindo also in this approach talks about a further transition to the cosmic being. And that is where the previous chapter brought us. The previous chapter was on cosmic consciousness, actually the realization of the cosmic self. So from the individual self to the cosmic self, this was the transition that he took us through. And it is at this point that Sri Aurobindo begins to complicate the ordinary understanding of the knowledge of yoga and pushes it towards what he is uh, intending, which is the idea of an integral knowledge. And so in this chapter on the cosmic self, on the realization of the cosmic self, he begins to tell us that it is not enough to just know a conscious cosmic being or cosmic self that is either transcendent or that lies behind everything in the cosmos. So he starts touching on what one might call the modes of the self. The idea of the modes of the self is that the self can actually exist in a number of ways. This is the notion of modes. The idea of modes in Western philosophy is related to a tripartite division uh, between self, attributes, and modes. It's a Spinozan definition. And for Spinoza, for example, there is the self, or there is the substance with a capital S, and that can have two attributes. Actually, it can have infinite attributes, but we know it only through two attributes. They are the cosmic attributes through which it is known. One of them is intelligence, or what he calls the the attribute of understanding, res cogitans, and the other is the attribute of extension, res extensa. Attribute of cogitation or of understanding can lead to modes of the self or of the substance that are that of mental beings. An attribute of extension leads to the modes that are of physical beings or entities, materialized entities. So in a similar way, Sri Aurobindo is going to look at the modes of the self as the various ways by which the divine has become the word. What are the modes in which the divine resides as word? So already in the chapter on the cosmic self, he has introduced these modes, and now he is detailing them. And in that chapter, the modes that he has introduced is one as a transcendent mode. That is a mode in which the cosmos is exceeded and exists in an exclusive dimension of experience. The second is as a cosmic mode of containment. In other words, the transcendent, as it were, has become a spatial extension, the essence of space. The third is as an immanent mode in which the spatial extension is diversified into atomicities, into monads, and each of these is a mode of the cosmic being. And finally, the fourth is that the cosmic being exists as a nature. In other words, and he touches on the fact that it is a tripartite nature, mental, vital, and physical, that operates in terms of the movements of forces inside the cosmos. So these forces inside the cosmos are, being experienced in and as the being that has become immanent in the cosmos. And so we have an experience of a cosmic being and of becoming through these forces that each monadic entity is experiencing as if its own. So this is in a nutshell the big picture that Sri Aurobindo gives us in this chapter on the realization of the cosmic self. And coming to the modes of the self, he raises the question about the experience of these things, that traditional knowledge of yoga has not seen it like this. And it has not seen it like this because it has taken as its aim the entry into one mode, usually the transcendent mode. But some have actually moved towards the cosmic mode. And I see. Okay, if somebody has a option to record it, maybe if everybody has an option to record it, whoever wants to record it can do so. So the cosmic mode, some people enter into the cosmic mode. And then Sri Aurobindo over here is going to make the point that each of these modes in our experience tends to be exclusive. In other words, if you have one of these experiences, you assume that that is the exclusive mode of the divine. You may have more than one experience, and then what happens is that you start having these experiences at different times, or you may have more than one experience in a kind of hierarchic fashion. One is subordinate to the other, etc. So this has led to a variety of spiritual positions in the world. This is why we have so many sects and cults and religions that don't see eye to eye, or that create their own schema of inclusion and exclusion within each other. It's a very important point because, in a way, the entirety of the synthesis of yoga is not just about various approaches to the integral, but behind all that, to ask about what is the question of becoming of our times. What is the central question of becoming of our times? You know, this kind of question is central to yoga at all times. From the time of the Buddha, he formulated his central question of becoming, arising out of the social circumstances of his time as one of escape, uh, as one of getting over the problems of suffering. Sri Aurobindo formulates the question of becoming, which is germane to him, but which is really of our times. And that is the question of the integral. How does one arrive at a totality of experience that does not co-opt a variety of modes in the name of one exclusive mode, which is the source of all the conflict of our world? So I think we finished 2 paragraphs of this chapter last time, and in the first paragraph he introduces this notion of the integral, and says, actually he begins to do that. In the second one, he makes it even more explicit. As we can see in the very first line of the second one, he introduces the word supramental. But rightly to know and express the highest is not easy for man, the mental being, because the highest truth and therefore the highest modes of existence are supramental. They repose on the essential unity of what seem to the intellect and mind and are to our mental experience of the world opposite poles of existence and idea, and therefore irreconcilable opposites and contradictions, but to the supramental experience are complementary aspects of the same truth. So this is really the crux we discussed last time about the nature of mind with a capital N, not just human mind, but mind consciousness that begins from the overmind. And the nature of mind that becomes harder as we travel towards a closer contact with matter is that of exclusive truths, truths that are affirmed in exclusive reality of each other. See? And you know, so by the time we come to our experience of things, which is a grounded experience, an experience which is, one may say, arising from the collusion of mind and matter. Matter itself is a function of this exclusivity of the mind, of the cosmic mind, coming down to a certain view of the atomicity of substance. And this atomicity of substance gives us the notion of discrete forms. And these discrete forms, therefore, condition our knowledge of the world as discrete truths, a knowledge of ourselves as exclusive truths, the knowledge of others as conditioned truths. So this is where we come to our problem. And Sri Aurobindo is saying there's another kind of consciousness that he's calling the supramental consciousness, in which we find all these modes of the self at once as coexisting to form a cosmos and all its entities. And he ends with one of the crux, this paragraph, with one of the crux problems of philosophy, which is that given this sense of atomicity, we experience an exclusivity of the mind. We experience the cosmos at best as a fragmented whole in which these fragments are parts of the one. And he's saying that is a central problem, defect of the mind that has to be overcome in the knowledge that these parts are not just parts, but they are the one. This last sentence of the first paragraph of the second paragraph uh, foregrounds that, uh, as he says over here. Uh, until we have transformed the habits of our mentality so that it shall live entirely in this knowledge, reconciling all differences in the one, we do not live in the real truth because we do not live in the real unity. The accomplished sense of unity is not that in which all are regarded as parts of one whole, waves of one sea, but that in which each as well as the all is regarded wholly as the divine, wholly as ourself in a supreme identity. Now, from here we entered into I think this is the third paragraph. No, this whole thing was no, this is, yeah, we entered the third paragraph. We read the third paragraph. I don't think we discussed it in full. And in this third paragraph, I think maybe it might be a good idea to stop at this point, ask if there are any questions and discussions, and reread that third paragraph.
Debashish.
Yes, yes, Jonathan.
Just a question you touched upon earlier in our talks here, but in terms of this sort of the assumption of the fall, and we've talked how we find that across world traditions. Is there, what would be a variation? I mean, not a variation. What would be a different way of approaching this problem? Is there other kind of, I'm not sure how to even frame what I'm saying here. Is there other ontologies or metaphysics, traditional systems that don't start with that assumption?
Yeah, I think the assumption of the fall is a very important one, because that's exactly what he's talking about over here, that there is a division that has taken place. That division is the fall. That, you know, because if we don't recognize the fall, then we begin living in a kind of illusion that the one pervades the world and is all its modes, when we actually don't experience that. That is true. What you're saying is really true. But the mythology of the fall, however it occurs, ought to give us the sense of a emergence out of the fall and a reconstitution of the one in all its modes. This is, I think, the real issue, and it hasn't been done in a clear manner, even in India. So the mythology of the in India, starting from the Veda, but in various ways in the Upanishads. And if you look at it carefully, if you interpret it carefully, you'll see that it is a mythology of a fall and a re-emergence. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, of which I had been giving some studies in Lodi is doing exactly that right from the beginning. So is the Aitareya Upanishad. Um, the Purusha Sukta is not clear about it, but actually that is what it's all about. And, so the mythology of the fall is something that begins to give us a picture of this particular defect or division that Sri Aurobindo is talking about, but is not clear about what we can do about it. This, as I said earlier, uh, the fact that Humpty Dumpty fell down and had a big fall is pervasive in world cultures. But how are the pieces to be put together? Either we can say all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put it together again. Or we can ask the question, what are the conditions under which it can be put together? What does it mean? That is the big question. And I think world philosophies have not been very clear about that. Partly, I would say, because historically we have not arrived at a vision of the integral before our times. We have approached it, but to make it into a problem of becoming, as I said, that's the problem of becoming of our age. You require that the problem of division and fragmentation becomes exacerbated at a cosmic level. We feel it like never before. And that's what we are doing right now. We are experiencing it as a insoluble problem that has to be solved in our times. Otherwise, we'll extinct ourselves.
Can't do it. Oh, Devashish?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I've got a question. Sri Aurobindo, he went into seclusion about 1926, and I think he had already reached the overmind status. What was he, how did he approach, or how was he living in order and doing, what was he doing to get to the overmind status? He was not in seclusion during the period where he obtained that status, if I think, if my reading was correct.
So, yeah, in 1926, Sri Aurobindo had a major realization that he calls the Siddhi, right? And this Siddhi was what he refers to as the descent of overmind into his body, right? And essentially, he begins using the word overmind from that point. He didn't even use that term before that. And, I've written an article on this, which I can send you, Michael, unless I don't remember if I've sent it to you. But basically, what is happening at this point is that Sri Aurobindo, okay, this, what we just read, this very last paragraph that sentence of that last paragraph that I read is what Sri Aurobindo was trying to achieve at a cosmic level. In other words, the fact that we live in a experience of the many as parts of the one is the experience of overmind. And the fact that the many are the one is the experience of supermind. And what Sri Aurobindo says, until that point, you see, he had already risen into the overmind. After the jail experience, he formulated this problem, because with what Vivekananda showed him of the intermediate planes, he began seeing that there was a way to arrive at the formation of an individual station in which the whole cosmos was encompassed as one in overmind. And then one had to stabilize that, because if one didn't stabilize that, one couldn't have that cosmic consciousness in its full, which was necessary for the supramental. So this is what he had arrived at already by 1920. And what he was trying to do at that point was, in his words, to supramentalize the overmind. In other words, do exactly what he has talked about over here, the cosmic condition in which everything is seen as parts of the one can be converted into another cosmic condition in which everything experiences itself as the one. So the point of departure is the overmind, and that's what he was trying to transform at that point. But he was not being successful. He says, the mother says it. He told the mother, because she came in 1920, that all his attempts were failing, because every time he made some progress, there was a return to this condition, the ontology of separation. So the mother said that they had to prepare the lower forms of consciousness. They had to come down into the vital and into the material, into the physical, and even further into the subconscious, and start preparing these layers of consciousness, because unless the foundation had some receptivity, it was impossible for the descent of supermind into overmind. So as they were doing that, this happened. And I think Sri Aurobindo, if we go by all that he's saying prior to 1926, he thought that it was the descent of the supermind. But as he grew more familiar with what had happened, he realized that it wasn't yet the supermind. It was the descent of the overmind that had taken place. And that's when he realized that he needed to focus all his energies to achieving that final step of what we are talking about over here, that conversion. And that's what what made him go into seclusion.
Concerning the fall,
Yes.
Joe Pierce writes about this as the error correction error. In other words, if we stop to correct the error that we made, then we're focused on the error when we should just leave it, so to speak, and get back on course of realizing the one, or God, in ourselves and in everything else.
Yeah, so this is, it's a complex point that you make, Deborah. You see, the course of error correction being itself an error. We can talk about that. It depends on what version of the fall we are looking at. That's the point that Jonathan was making. There are many mythologies of the fall. And the Christian mythology of the fall is one of the worst, because it pins the problem on the human. None of the other mythologies of the fall pin the problem on the human. They pin it as a cosmic condition. It's God's fall, not man's fall. And it isn't, you see, to say that it's an error of error correction is to actually put even the correction in man's court. Neither was the problem originally man's, nor is the correction man's. It is the divine's. That's why the whole synthesis of yoga begins with the epigram, all life is yoga, because man is there only to come into contact with the forces of becoming that are already evolving. And this error correction is not man's error correction, it's nature's error correction. It's the nature of evolution. Otherwise, we should say that evolution is not happening. evolution is moving exactly in that direction. And the way it moves is to present problems of becoming to mankind from age to age. And that's why I said this is a problem of becoming. It's not individuals trying to error correct. Individuals have to find a solution to this, otherwise they'll extinct themselves. What this guy is talking about completely misses that point. We have to first formulate the problem of becoming and find the will and the consciousness by which we overcome it. It cannot be done just at the individual level. It has to be done also at the cosmic level. But that cosmic level is not what the Christians consider to be an original sin and an overcoming of the sin.
Oh, right. Pierce counts on grace.
Yeah, but it's also not just an individual problem.
Yes.
It is a cosmic problem. It's a problem that needs to be understood. Otherwise, we'll only find the one in ourselves in one of its modes. This is the entire point. We have to find it in all of its modes and find the one that includes all the modes. What are the relations of the modes? The relations of the modes constitutes the real idea of cosmos. And that is exactly what we are moving towards in understanding an integral knowledge.
Just a question. Can it be called error? Like the error, isn't it a language of the mind?
Yeah, I think that is also a good point. Can we even use the word error? I think, that is also part of this notion of the fall. If we see it as a kind of, something that the human has done, then it becomes an error. If we see it as a condition, then it isn't an error, but it is a problem. All the same, if we don't call it an error, we can call it a problem. It is not a problem of the divine, but it is a problem of the creatures of the divine who are experiencing a problematic condition. By problem, we don't also necessarily need to think of it as something bad. The cosmos is a problem that is being solved through experience.
Yeah, I mean the problem itself is the mover, right? Like,
yeah, the problem is what is moving the cosmos. The cosmos itself is a problematic field, as people like Bergson and Deleuze would call it. It's a problematic field. In other words, it's a field in which a problem is solving itself.
Something that just came to mind in terms of seeing the one in all things, and time, the idea that it's an evolutionary movement going on here, but there's some kind of a phenomenology of time in which we would have to reconcile the past, present, and future almost differently, according to how we can see the all in one. I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because again, some of the other world cultures, like let's say Taoism, would look towards sort of a golden era in the past, and you return. So it's like they privilege sort of a phenomenology of the past. And I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the balance, I guess, because there's other schools that would put a lot more emphasis in the present moment, and then also of, let's say, the types of people or the people to come. We've talked about that before. And so I guess there's different balancing of how you position different perspectives of time. I just was maybe speak to that for a second.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important. And I think, so Sri Aurobindo addresses this in his social and political writings. He's not so overt about it in the Synthesis of Yoga. And he does talk about it also in the Life Divine, but particularly in terms of the phenomenology of time, both at the cosmic level as well as at the individual level. indeed, as you say, there is a transition from, you know, you may talk about the three kinds of time, you know, one, not just past, present, and future, but the three kinds of time as habit, you know, the habitual time, for example, is the first phenomenology of time. Matter itself follows habitual time. You know, rudimentary creatures, when life emerges, follow habitual time. Humanity even follows habitual time in the most. And, you know, ordinary existence, what is called facticity, is made up of habitual time. You know, the primitive evolution of life is is characterized by the phenomenology of habitual time. Then we have time as creative memory, and time as creative memory is one in which, in a way, it is particularly human. It's human more than other animals because we begin having a new kind of relationship with time, which pervades individual and ontological memory. History of man is also, the history of the cosmos is also part of our memory, not merely at the immanent level of the body, which is the habitual, you know, but at the level of a freedom of choice, so that the memory of pasts converge in our time, and we have some freedom in choosing what kind of past we can draw on in creating the future. See, so that is a second phenomenology of time that is also not fully even realized. Even people like Heidegger, etc., are talking about moving into, or even Nietzsche are talking about moving into the second phenomenology of time, in which life becomes creative, much, or Bergson, in which life becomes creative, and ultimately we come into contact with the creative energy of time, which is in some philosophers like Bergson called the élan vital. But there is a third kind of time, and that is the time of the eternal return, where we actually break through to the point where the one is expressing itself from moment to moment in each of us. See, so that kind of living in that phenomenology of time requires us to make the transition into a unity of experience in which only the one exists in us and in all things. And it's returning from moment to moment completely unpredictably. So that sort of understanding of phenomenology of time is what Sri Aurobindo is talking about as the yugas in the human cycle. And his understanding of yugas is much more complex than the traditional understanding. So his understanding of yugas is as this kind of phenomenology of time. It's a movement from something which is spontaneous. It is symbolic in the sense that coded into its habits is the perfection of the one manifesting. Then we move from that, there is a fall, and that's the notion of the fall in terms of the yugas. It's like a 4-stage fall. The second stage fall brings us into a experience of time in which we have a separation from the truth, but we have the capacity to be heroes. It's the age of the heroes. Then, or what he calls the typal age. And then we fall further into a split division from the manifesting coordinated harmony of the one. And that's when we start experiencing chaos, and we start trying to hold it together by laws and conventions. And ultimately we can't even do that, and we release the anarchy of the individuals. And that's the age in which we are right now. And that's exactly why the return takes place. It's not a return to the origin of the past, but it's a return to a higher cycle of the spiral. And that's why it's called the fulfilled age, the Krita Yuga. And in that, the phenomenology of the time is that of each individual experiencing itself to be nothing but that last line we read, the all is wholly the divine, holy as ourself in a supreme identity. So I have a question from Aditya. I had one question on a topic we discussed in a previous chapter. How can the image of the ethereal Brahman be one of practical help in meditating on abstract ideas? Okay. The ethereal Brahman, and Sri Aurobindo uses this notion of the ethereal Brahman or the ether as the containing consciousness of Brahman. So the cosmos is a single cosmos. The cosmos is a single being and a single becoming. So this meditation on the ethereal Brahman is this meditation, Sarvam Khalubidam, all this is the Brahman. It's seen in a cosmic sense. If we can hold in our minds the fact that whatever we are seeing around us is contained by one being, that is manifesting as all the beings within it. See? That there is one containing being, that there is something that holds the entire cosmos together. It's not just physically. This is what the Gita calls Loka Sangraha, the holding together of the world. That there is a consciousness that holds everything together. However disharmonious it seems, there is something, there is an anchor that is holding everything together. And that the forces in the world, however they are acting, whether they are acting for me or against me, are ultimately coming from this. And everything that we are experiencing in the world is a call or summons to respond to the oneness that is trying to maintain itself in the world. This idea, if we can hold this, because it's so easy to forget, all we see is our individual existence, and either somebody is good to me or bad to me, either somebody is promoting what I want to do or somebody is impeding what I want to do. Instead of that, if I can look at things as the one containing being that is acting through different beings and asking for responses from every being so as to maintain and amplify its oneness. That is the image of the ethereal Brahman in its more integral sense, Sarvam Khalu Vidam Brahman. And that is actually essentially also the teaching of the Gita in that sense. Now, more exclusive meditation on the ethereal Brahman can just be that there is a containment, that there is the one being and everything in the world is a aspect or is held by the one being. So that is more like, the first of the two scenarios in that last chapter, that everything is a part of the one. Even that is a great help, because that can bring us closer to a cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, I got it. So one more question I had was, what is the difference between realizing and just knowing something? Like, so if I read something, I know, I understand it, but in the chapter that we are currently reading, Sri Aurobindo says that is different from realizing. So
Yeah.
what is that? I'm not able to understand.
Yeah. An important we made is that so far we think that knowledge is understanding, and that is one of the That's one of the difficulties that has arisen in our history, in which the mind has become the primary instrument for human existence. We try to understand things with the mind and call that knowledge. But existential knowledge, I mean, we can, firstly, to make it a little easier, we can pluralize the idea of knowledge. In other words, not only to know with the mind, but whatever we do is also a knowledge, right? Your body has a knowledge. Your will has a knowledge. Your emotions have a knowledge. So these are all forms of knowledge, forms of knowing. An integral form of knowing is to know by consciousness. In other words, these things that we are talking about, that there is only one being, or the one being exists in all beings, they can be known in experience. In other words, that there is something inside you that can become these things. That is knowledge. Now, before that, we think that that is not possible. In fact, the whole of Western philosophy is based on the assumption that that is not possible. People like Kant are saying that God, we can reason about God. We can speculate about God. We can deduce that given the conditions in the world, there must be a God. But we cannot know a God by experience. What Sri Aurobindo is saying is that that's the only understanding of knowledge from the viewpoint of yoga. We can know it by experience. We can become the only being there is. Because the only being there is has become us. We are a layered form of consciousness, but one consciousness has layered itself into what we are. Therefore, we can become that consciousness which we are limiting and conditioning by the consciousness that we have become.
Devashish, this is Michael again. How do you think about all the information that Darwin created in terms of how does that jive with the fall and the project of the yoga? Is there anything worthwhile in knowing his discoveries?
So, Michael, I think Darwin plays a very important role in history and in even the evolution of evolution, in the evolution of the ideas we are talking about. Because, you know, in world knowledge at the mental level, he introduces this notion of evolution. His notion of evolution is different from, see, there was a philosophical notion of evolution already there before Darwin, and that is something like Hegelian evolution. Hegelian evolution or philosophical evolution, pre-Darwinian philosophical evolution, is about an idea that is unfolding in a predictable manner. And particularly for the philosophers of the Enlightenment, it is unfolding according to reason. So it is taking rational steps towards becoming what it is in seed. So this view of evolution is really a inductive view coming from what we see all around us. The seed becomes the tree. You know, the egg becomes the hatched bird. The bird produces another egg. So there's a circularity, but at the same time, the circularity follows an evolutionary pattern from seed to fulfillment. See? So in Darwin's case, what we find is that an empirical study of evolution takes place. And he's looking at it from the material standpoint and saying that due to purely material forces, there is an evolution that goes on. And that evolution changes things. It is not necessarily a circularity. That there is a evolution and adaptation towards greater complexity that is arising. And this adaptation towards greater complexity makes us more and more equal to the cosmos and its forces. See? So philosophically, that is all that is important to take over into another kind of idea, that there is possibly a open-ended evolution of consciousness that may be occurring, in which we are becoming more and more equal to the cosmos, adapted to the cosmos and its unpredictable forces. We can take this at a more limited, understanding of man in the cosmos and the forces of science and technology. We are becoming more adapted due to our ability to handle these forces, given our faculty of mind and ability to know the laws of the world. But we can also take it as a development of consciousness that is pre-rational and post-rational, so that consciousness is complexifying in nature itself, philosophically, in idea form. And we are headed towards a greater adequacy and even maybe an identity with the consciousness of cosmos, not just its handling. So Darwinian evolution can open a door to thinking about the open-ended evolution of consciousness, which would not be Darwinian, but nevertheless, it would give a new window to history.
Now, Darwinian evolution wouldn't presuppose a fall, though, would it? It's
No.
based on mechanism. It's sort of like being pushed from behind and causality,
Yeah,
in that sense.
absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Right. And so in terms of, now these two polarities of the finality or mechanism and then teleology or finality on the other side, it's, I guess, how integral yoga, the yoga is really hastening the self-conscious awareness of realizing everything as one. But that's, again, it's sort of like, it's a very fine line, isn't it? Because if you privilege a worldview that sort of bases itself too much on causality, then you might be actually missing out on freedom itself.
Yeah, this is an important point, and one needs to understand this point. And that's the reason why, if we look at the Sri Aurobindo's view of evolution as a determinism, as something that follows succeeding steps, without realizing that we are the ones that make that successive condition take place as much as any other forces that make it happen. You see, this is the fact that we don't exist outside the cosmos, but neither does the cosmos exist outside us. It's a inside-out problem. So from that point of view, this, talking about a teleology of finalism, it's not even a teleology of final, it's an open-ended teleology, which has stages, but the stages are stages of a problematic becoming that we have to participate in. This is the way in which we have to understand Sri Aurobindo. We have to understand Sri Aurobindo in terms of the statement, all life is yoga, not in terms of a view of the successive stages of consciousness unfolding outside of the human, or just making the human into its instrument. this is the real crux of it. This is the reason why, as he's going to point out, the divine has taken its station as a certain mode in every individual, because the individual is the subject of this evolution. It relates to one of the famous dialogue between Einstein and Tagore, right? Where Einstein's view was cosmos and its laws exist with or without any of its creatures. And human duty is to know those laws, you see. And Tagore was saying the human is a participant in the unfolding of the cosmos. Of course, he did not go to this extent that what we are talking about with regard to being the subject of the mutations of the cosmos. But he was talking from an aesthetic point of view that the cosmos mirrors itself and experiences itself in its creatures and gets meaning from that. Its meaning is not to be sought outside the human in some perfect order that exists before the human, but in the way in which humans interact with it to make meaning out of it. Okay, I think maybe we should read this paragraph, second paragraph, and discuss it at this point. And Jeff, would you like to lead us into this paragraph?
Sure, but I'm getting a bell. There you go.
Yeah, it's it's going to stop in a moment.
So is it the second paragraph or the third? And yet so complex is the Maya?
And yet so complex is the Maya of the infinite.
Got it. Greetings, everyone. And yet, so complex is the Maya of the infinite. There is a sense in which the view of all as parts of the whole, waves of the sea, or even as in a sense separate entities, becomes a necessary part of the integral truth and the integral knowledge. For if the self is always one in all, yet we see that for the purposes at least of the cyclic manifestation, it expresses itself in perpetual soul forms which preside over the movements of our personality, through the worlds and the eons. This persistent soul existence is the real individuality, which stands behind the constant mutations of the thing we call our personality. It is not a limited ego, but a thing in itself infinite. It is, in truth, the infinite itself consenting from one place of its being to reflect itself in a perpetual soul experience. This is the truth which underlies the Sankhya theory of many Purushas, many essential, infinite, free, and impersonal souls, reflecting the movements of a single cosmic energy. It stands also in a different way behind the very different philosophy of qualified monism, which arose as a protest against the metaphysical excesses of Buddhistic nihilism and illusionist Advaita. The old semi-Buddhistic, semi-Sankhya theory, which saw only the quiescent and nothing else in the world except a constant combination of the five elements and the three modes of conscious energy, lighting up their false activity by the consciousness of the quiescent, in which it is reflected, is not the whole truth of the Brahman. We are not a mere mass of changing mind stuff, life stuff, body stuff, taking different forms of mind and life and body from birth to birth, so that at no time is there any real self or conscious reason of existence behind all the flux of none except that quiescent, who cares for none of these things. There is a real and stable power of our being behind the constant mutation of our mental, vital, and physical personality. And this we have to know and preserve in order that the infinite may manifest himself through it according to his will, in whatever range and for whatever purpose of his eternal cosmic activity.
So here Sri Aurobindo does something that he does often, which is he does a turnaround. And of course, it's a nuanced turnaround. It's not a contradictory turnaround. The point he's making is, and we have to look at this transition from the previous paragraph to this in terms of three images. The first image is that there is one being which is multiple, and that being multiple, it is the one being that exists in each of its multiples. They are the modes of the being, as we had discussed earlier. The second image is that there is one being and it is made up of many parts, so that the parts are only parts of the one being. They are not modes of the one being. They are like parts. The one being is greater and exceeds all its parts. And the third is that there are parts and the one being only exists as each part. See? So it's like turning the picture inside out. The one becomes the primary reality that exists in its parts in the first image. The one and the many exist at a collateral, in a collateral reality in the second. And in the third, the many exist as the primary reality, and the one has turned itself inside out into the many. And in this condition, we may say we recognize the world in which we live. In this condition, we are made to see that there is some reason why this fragmentation into completely separate, exclusive entities has come about. And that is due to, as he says, the complexity of the Maya of the infinite. What is that reason why this view has emerged? He has not brought that out at this point, but it is clearly for the play of the multiplicity. It is clearly because this is the intention of the one as a form of its, or a mode of its existence, the mode of its existence as cosmos. And so hidden in this paragraph is also the purpose of the cosmos. And we can see that over here in this line where he says, it is not a limited ego, but a thing in itself infinite. He's talking of the individuals, and what is the truth of the individual. It is not a limited ego, but a thing in itself infinite. It is in truth the infinite itself, consenting from one plane of its being to reflect itself in a perpetual soul experience. So what is that one plane of its being? That one plane of its being is the plane of bliss or ananda. And it is doing this reflection, holding its own cosmic reality through the plane of supermind of Vijnana. Because the real idea of cosmos is what makes possible this coexistence of the multiplicity of the one in a play of the one. And this play of the bliss of the one is the whole meaning of this cosmos. This is what makes Sri Aurobindo fundamentally attuned to the Vaishnava philosophy. This is for the Leela of Krishna that this entire cosmos exists. It is for the play of the bliss of the Ras Leela. So this is what is the reason for the multiplicity in the cosmos. And Sri Aurobindo is going to talk about it in terms of two other philosophies. And before that, as he says, that there's a lot in this paragraph. We can see hidden in this paragraph the idea of the play of bliss. We can see hidden in this paragraph something about the cycles and what Jonathan was talking about of the phenomenology of time. As he says over here, for if the self is always one and all, yet we see that for the purposes at least of the cyclic manifestation, it expresses itself in perpetual soul forms which preside over the movements of our personality through the worlds and the aeons. And what Sri Aurobindo is going to point out is that there is a way by which, according to the real idea of the cosmos, there are four major manifesting energies, both in space and in time. In space, it manifests as the four cosmic Purushas and the four Mahashaktis. And in time, also it manifests as these four, but they become four souls that sometimes he refers to as the four Manus, Chatvaro Manuva. And they are like the four Manus that are the souls of the anthropos of the cosmos that control the way in which time unfolds in the phenomenology of time that we were discussing. The experience that each cycle of the yuga has, each of these yugas has its own experience of time controlled by the word soul. And that word soul is one of the four emanations of the Supreme Being that then multiplies itself into its own infinity of its diverse properties that become the individuals of the cosmos. And that takes place through souls. And so we find that this kind of distribution of souls has its own hierarchy. Each of us is a soul that is static and dynamic at the same time. And he will get into that later as he's expanding on the modes. And the static part is what is known as the Jivatma, and it stands as the stationary being behind the mutations throughout the cycle that are integrating the possibilities of the cycle in each soul. And behind the Jivatman stands one of these Manavas or Manus. And the Manu itself stands as one of the emanations of one of the four Mahashaktis. So this is how this notion of the soul that stands behind as a form of the cyclic manifestation is the mechanism by which the many express the one. And in expanding that, he talks about two philosophies. One of them is the Sankhya philosophy, and the other is the philosophy of qualified monism or Vishishtadvaita. In the Sankhya philosophy, in the old Sankhya philosophy, there are many Purushas and one Prakriti. See? And Sankhya gets at it from this viewpoint that it is trying to account for multiple subjective positions in the world. And so, since it is part of that entire school that we have to become free alone, that each of us has to find our own freedom, it does not look for a single one that has become all this, but it stops at the point where each knows its own freedom from the conditionings of Prakriti. That's the reason why it's talking about many Purushas. We have to realize in this that the entire field of yoga is made up of problems of becoming. Metaphysics is not about finding a single truth, but about finding an adequate description of the world that pertains to the problem of becoming that has been projected. If our problem of becoming is how can each individual be free, then we'll create a metaphysics that has no need for a single one. It only has need for many, many subjects. That's what Sankhya is doing. But what Sri Aurobindo is pointing out is that in doing so, it is actually giving voice to one of the modes of the self. And that mode of the self is the Jivatman mode of the self, the mode of the self of the permanent Akshara Purusha or unchanging Purusha at the peak of every changing soul existence of every individual. Then there is a second kind of philosophy that talks about the many as being the truth of reality, and that is Vishishtadvaita or qualified monism of Ramanuja. And according to that, because Ramanuja was also a Vaishnava, the one is known through the many. In other words, each soul is actually a veiled manifestation of the one. Nitya, eternal, veiled manifestation of the one. And so in this sense, we find another status of the many. Just as Sankhya is pointing to a status of the still and unchanging Purusha in each individual, Vishishtadvaita is pointing to the mutating play of the soul in each individual. So you may say it is pointing to an aspect of the psychic being, some aspect of the psychic being. And these two together are giving voice to the individual mode of the self. And Sri Aurobindo says that they stand in contradiction to views to which there is no individual soul, like either the Advaitic view or the Buddhistic view. And he's talking about this monism of these views as a semi-Buddhistic, semi-Sankhya theory. I mean, that he's talking about illusionist Advaita as that. But he's also referring to a narrow Buddhism, which is only talking about the escape from the world, because there is no self in it. And neither in Advaita, there is a self, an Atman, but the Atman is to be dissolved. The Atman is to not even be dissolved. It is to be recognized as essentially non-existent. So in these views, it's really a kind of an extension of Sankhya in which there is a single Prakriti and its play, the play of Prakriti is creating these semblances of souls. And these souls are moving by the power of habit and the power of conditioned momentum of karma from life to life. And true liberation lies in escape from that. So again, as a problem of becoming, neither Buddhism nor Advaita require a soul. They are not trying to create a metaphysics that says there is no soul. That is a complete mistake. They are creating a metaphysics in which what they are trying to achieve is addressed in an adequate fashion, and no soul is required for that. That's the reason why we don't have the notion of a soul either in Buddhism or the notion of a real and eternal soul in Advaita. But Sri Aurobindo is going to take the point that there is a real and stable power of our being behind the constant mutation of our mental, vital, and physical personality. So this is the individual mode of self, both in two of its forms, as you will point out, as a unchanging Purusha and as a Purusha that stands behind the mutations of the world and evolves with it.
Debashish, could you restate that, addressing how close is Advaita to Buddhism? Are they both very similar? And then perhaps a second part of the question is, do they have a description of how they came to be involved in the world? If there's no divine project.
Yeah. So yes, Michael. I mean, your first question: are they very similar? And there are forms of Advaita before Shankara, by the way, and these forms of Advaita pre-Shankara Advaita are not necessarily what Sri Aurobindo calls illusionistic. They also hold Jivan Mukti as a possibility. But I won't be going there because he's talking about Advaita Vedanta as we know it today through Shankara. And, many people have, and this is not just Sri Aurobindo, but scholarship at large has used the word crypto-Buddhist for Shankara. And this notion of crypto-Buddhist comes because Shankara he's supposed to be an 8th century thinker. And it is supposed that Buddhism had reached a very pervasive kind of influence during his time. And he wanted to respond to its questions. And so the metaphysics of Buddhism, and as I was saying, originally, I don't see these as metaphysical systems per se. I see these as practical metaphysics. In other words, the metaphysics is not giving us a description of the world, but is giving us an adequate description of what we need to know to arrive at a goal of becoming. So, however, over time, what happens is that this kind of practical metaphysics exists in a comparative field with other practical metaphysics. And it is also competing in that field, because there are people who would ask the question, why should I come to you? What about this question, which these other guys are answering? So it makes the field evolve. It makes the metaphysics evolve. It forces the metaphysics to answer questions that it never wanted to answer. And as a result, it takes certain stands, like this stand about there is no soul. Buddhism will make a categoric statement that there is no soul. And so somebody who comes later into a culture in which everybody believes that, or a majority of people believe that, is forced to reintroduce the idea of soul in a backhanded way. And this is what Shankara does. He tries to say that, okay, there is another way of understanding Buddhism, which is that not that there is no being, but that there is only one being and everything else is an illusion. So the illusionism of Buddhism and the illusionism of Advaita are similar but different, because there is a kind of a pattern of trying to respond to each other that is going on over here. And as to your second, what was your second question, Michael? Can you reframe that?
I'm not sure, you might have answered it already. That was, if they didn't think it was a divine project of some sort, then how did they figure they got into, why would they have gotten into the mess, or how did they figure they got into the mess?
Yeah, good point. So I think this is my answer to your question, Michael. Buddhism is the one that first emerges, right? Buddha is a 5th century BC thinker or yogi who arrives into a social situation which is ridden by caste and other social inequalities. And his major problem is he sees oppression all around him. And he asks the question, how can we be free of suffering? There is existential suffering, of course, which is free of time and history, but there is also, importantly, social suffering. And so Buddhism is, in a way, a kind of liberation psychology from the very beginning. How can we be liberated from this oppressive condition? And he doesn't give the answer that we can fight for our rights. He gives the answer that we can be free of all forms of conditioning. And in trying to give that answer, he goes into an extreme form of transcendentalism. That is really the beginning, the first step towards this type of escapist philosophy that then structures the field of one aspect of thinking in India and also being or becoming in India. Shankara is following that, because what happens as a result of that is that otherwise it would have just been something that people followed, but a few people followed, but they proselytize, they go out and try to get adherents, and then a big emperor, Ashoka, comes along and tries to universalize it across India, and it becomes really a kind of a national metaphysics. And then anything else that wants to exist has to respond to it. This is how to answer your question, we got into that mess.
But if you are Shankara and you succeed in doing what is required, you are Jivatman. What happens to you? You decide to, you automatically vanish? You decide to vanish? What happens there? If you were
Yeah.
a being rather than nothing, what happens? What's the difference?
Yeah, so I mean that's a loaded question, Michael. I mean, who knows what happens? Did that guy? The mother has a take on this. The mother says, yes, it's possible to erase oneself in Brahman, and 9 people out of 10 who entered that gate decide not to go that way. And so, of course, we don't know. And in her own case, she says this. I mean, it's a very interesting conversation she has with regard to her own experience of the Buddha. You know, she has a prayer, one of her prayers is about Sakyamuni talking to her. And one of her good friends, Alexandra David Neal, was a Buddhist and a kind of a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, and she says that the Buddha does not exist anymore. He went into his eternal nirvana, and the mother says, I couldn't convince her, so I never even tried. But I know that he did not. I know that he still exists. So this is the question. The being may. It's the same for Vivekananda, for example, in a very similar way. Vivekananda was talking about Advaita ideas, and then you find in 1909, Sri Aurobindo, or 1908, Sri Aurobindo is talking about a visitation from Vivekananda. It's saying that a soul like Vivekananda's continues to evolve. So we don't know whether these people who are teaching Advaita Vedanta really disappear into the Brahman and the soul disappears, or they experience otherwise. Ramanuja has, who's the founder of Vishishta Advaita, has an answer to this as well. He says, yes, it is possible for a soul to enter into quiescence in the ocean of Brahman, but the divine chooses the point of time in which it brings it back into the manifestation. So, in other words, your idea that the soul was an illusion is itself an illusion. That's this person's point of view. So we don't know. I mean, in a real sense, in the sense of truth with a capital T, what happens to these souls? But it is very possible that either they continue to exist, or they continue to exist in a latent form, or they may be dissolved and absorbed, if that is what the Brahman decides.
So this dissolution is not the soul's choice, but the choice of the Brahman? Or is it a pact, or is it an appeal that the soul makes to the Brahman, and then that is may or may not be fulfilled by the Brahman?
So this question also is a very deep question, because ultimately the soul is the Brahman. So just as that's exactly what he's saying here, right? So it's a question of how much of its own power the soul realizes. Ultimately, as the mother says, everything is a question of power. the reason why the psychic being is not supramental is because it has to develop a knowledge of its own power, and that it does through the triple transformation. It does from stage to stage. In a similar way, if the soul can arrive at its full knowledge of its own truth, it can do whatever it wants. But prior to that, there are a variety of other things that it can do, like the options that you raised. It can come into a pact with the divine, or it can come into a quiescence in which it believes that it is dissolved, but it isn't actually dissolved, or, you know, it can really be dissolved.
Debashish, I don't recall exactly where this passage, but it seemed to me that Sri Aurobindo talks about this not knowing whether beings dissolve or not. And he's sort of humorous about it, or very ecumenical. He says something like, well, we really don't know, but shall we really argue about it? And at maybe some point we might know, something like that. Does that strike a memory in you?
Yeah, it's possible, Margaret. I'm not really sure, but it might be in one of the conversations.
Right.
And yeah, he would be characteristically humorous about it.
It was, and not, he wasn't, he was kind of extending a, like, not saying that he had the last say, that, you know, when we go through that, yeah.
Because all the answers are true, all the answers are possible. Every answer is possible.
Right.
Margaret,
To me, it was also, just one sec, it was also one of those moments when there's a certain, oh, Linda, are you going to say where that was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Was this the quote you meant? It's something, it's kind of this humorous thing about, oh, you don't find out until, you know, only the divine knows. And then he adds, or maybe he knows not. Something like that. Remember that one? He's talking about knowledge, and he says, well, you can't get to the knowledge until you become the divine, and that's when you will find out everything, or maybe not even then. Something like that. I don't know.
No, this is actually specifically talking about nirvana and remaining a soul or remaining an entity or not, and the different schools. And he's extending, like, you know, sort of like, and let's not argue, because we don't when we absolutely know, then we could have the final say, but we won't, you know, it's kind of like a philosophical kindness in a way, extending, like Debashish was saying, it's all true.
Philosophical agnosticism, actually, because, you know, I mean, this is the thing about problems of becoming. I mean, actually, Deleuze says the same thing. He says, I do not enter into philosophical arguments, because every philosopher has a right to choose their own becoming and find out what it is that they can become.
Right.
And so whether this is true or not is up to your own self-discovery. Basically,
right.
That's
yeah.
stand.
That's the gist of it. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's time to close for today. And we'll get together in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, Debashish.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debashish. It was wonderful.
Debashish.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debashish.
Thank you.